Welcome to our Good Friday reflection. My name is Debbie Pow and I'm Associate Priest at St Mary's, Charlcombe and St Stephen's, Lansdown. It's lovely to have this time and this space to reflect with you on Jesus' last hours. It's hard in this time of coronavirus to sit in this place of darkness. Somehow we need to do that if Easter is to have any meaning at all. Many will feel this year that they have lost something of our usual gathering together at St Mary's in our sacred space. And yet, as we carve out this time in our own homes, in the ordinariness of the day, it's good to remember that Jesus' last hours weren't played out in the sacred space, but in the ordinariness of everyday life in first century Palestine. And actually for what we've lost for our usual gathering, in the space that we are journeying at the moment, and with coronavirus and the pandemic around, the isolation, there are so many more resonances. We'll have so much more understanding of what what Jesus and his fellows went through. And those are the things I'd like to reflect on this morning. Reflection will last about 10 minutes. There will be a few short pauses between sections. Do pause the video if you want to take longer to reflect on anything. You might also like to read an account of Jesus' last days in the Gospels. If you haven't got much time, Mark is the shortest. If you've got a little longer, perhaps look at one of the other Gospels. So as we remember this familiar story that we remember each Sunday in the Eucharist, I'd like to focus on a few of the characters and some of the emotions going on. Many people at the moment are experiencing isolation. Isolation must have been something that Jesus experienced too. Arrested, singled out, on his own, in front of the trials. It's Jesus on his own who goes to his death, who hangs on the cross. Remember Peter who just hours earlier had said that he would follow Jesus to his death. Jesus who discovered his faith wasn't as strong as he thought it was, that fear had a stronger hold on him as he denied Christ 3 times. Until the cock crowed and he was reminded of Jesus' words that he would deny him 3 times. Peter runs away, weeping bitterly. Why? Was it the realization that Jesus was who he said he was? Peter had had this amazing experience of Jesus on the mountaintop at the Transfiguration. And yet in Jesus' moment of need, in his arrest, Peter had fled with everyone else. Fear had taken over. Maybe he was reminded too and suddenly understood Jesus' words that he was about to die. Maybe that sank in for Peter in the realization that Jesus knew what was going to happen, really knew. Maybe it was that Peter couldn't stand anymore. or maybe just that feeling of having let down someone that he loved, that he was his closest friend. There was so much fear around. Peter experienced it. It started with the fear of the Jewish leaders, fearful for their loss of popularity as Jesus' popularity rose, their loss of power, fearful for social disorder, what that would mean for the Romans clamping down on them. They handed Jesus over to be crucified out of fear. They handed him to Pilate, who glimpsed something of the deity of Jesus in his interview with him. And yet for Pilate, the fear and the threats from the Jewish leaders that if he didn't crucify Jesus, then he was no friend of Caesar's. What would that mean for Pilate? He was fearful for his life. So out of fear, he condemned Jesus to die. Jesus' friends may have been fearful, most of them. But the women stayed at a distance. Among them were Mary, his mother, and with the women was John, the disciple whom Jesus loved. Jesus' compassion, even in his agony on the cross, didn't end. As he entrusted his mother and John to the care of one another. And yet the women looked on, so helpless, so powerless. They couldn't change the course of events. They couldn't save Jesus' life. They couldn't touch him. They couldn't comfort him in his hour of need. I suspect Jesus drew comfort from their presence. No doubt they would have been praying for him. Many today with loved ones in hospital must feel a similar powerlessness, helplessness, entrusting their loved one to the care of the medical profession and to God, powerless to change the outcome. I'd like to end by returning to Jesus and to Scripture, which often speaks so deeply into our hearts at difficult times. I'm reading from Mark's Gospel, just remembering who it was, Jesus, who was hanging there, whose death was for us. Mark writes, "It was 9 o'clock in the morning when the crucifixion took place. A signboard was fastened to the cross above Jesus' head, announcing the charge against him. It read, 'The King of the Jews. At noon, darkness fell across the whole land until 3 o'clock. Then at that time, Jesus called out with a loud voice, "Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani," which means, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Some of the bystanders misunderstood and thought he was calling for the prophet Elijah. One of them ran and filled a sponge with sour wine, holding it up to him on a stick so he could drink. Then Jesus uttered another loud cry and breathed his last. And the curtain in the temple was torn in two from top to bottom.